Hello there and welcome back to the Libertarian Listener with me, Chris Wilkinson. I'm joined today by HARLEY Dalton. He's the Greater Manchester Area Manager for the UK Liberty Party. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. It's a sunny day in Manchester, which is usually rare, but actually quite common nowadays, which is pretty typical considering we're all confined to our homes.
Absolutely. And the first topic of conversation today is the death of George Floyd. Now, George Floyd died in police custody shortly after Officer Derek Chauvin kneeled on his neck in order to pin him down. Chauvin has since been sacked and charged for murder, but protests have broken out over his death in London, Manchester, Cardiff and Minneapolis in the United States, despite all the lockdown rules. In America, shops have been damaged by violent protesters and most goods have been looted. President Trump and the governor of Minnesota have claimed that Antifa, an extreme left-wing and domestic terrorist organisations, have hijacked the protests. Trump has since designated Antifa a terrorist organisation, despite the fact that they are an organised organisation which claim not to be an organisation in the first place. A decision CNN labelled crazy and unconstitutional. What happened regarding George Floyd was obviously appalling, and the looters are simply reinforcing the negative aspersions people have about minority demographics, certainly in the minds of racists. I feel as though what needs to be understood, though, is that his is just one case among many others, and it has to be said that you'll never see a protest when a white man has been the victim of exactly the same thing. Either all lives matter or none do. What are your thoughts on the George Floyd situation?
Well, there's two sides of it. Obviously, there's the issue of George Floyd himself and what happened. And then there's obviously the response to that, both generally and racially. I think you point out just offhand that when this happens to a white man, it doesn't tend to flare up in the same way it does with black people. Now, there is an argument to say that that's because these cultures or these communities feel more oppressed for various reasons than the white community does, and therefore have much more to say collectively than the white community does. But I would be more inclined to say that actually this kind of reaction to police violence, which is of course appalling, it speaks much more broadly to cultural problems and maybe socio-economic and socio-cultural problems within minority communities, and especially the black communities in America. And there are many reasons for that. I would say the charging of the officer with murder is, in my opinion, fully correct. What he did was, as far as I'm concerned, indefensible. And I believe the charge was for third-degree murder, which means that it was an action which took the life by actions without regard for life, but without intent or premeditation. I actually think that's not strong enough. At the very least, it should have been second degree, which is with intent. I think it's quite obvious that the officer, at least from the side of it, did have the intent to cause serious harm. Now you have the response to that, which is the protests and the police response. And I think both of those have been equally disgraceful, basically, in that the police are going about proving to everyone that the bad stereotype of them is correct. And the protesters are going about, in a way, proving to the nation that the criticisms of their communities are correct. And neither side is helping themselves here.
I mean, surely protests such as these only seek to unnecessarily stir up racial tensions while the main enemy, which is police brutality, gets away completely unchecked. Would you agree that this is not a case of white versus black, but rather state versus individual?
Well, it always is in some regards. White versus black has no real meaning unless there is some sort of institutional power behind it. And I don't believe that there is. I simply think that this is just a matter of the state versus the individual. And it just so happens to be the case that the black community, for whatever reason, has particular concerns which manifest themselves in these kind of, riotous actions. And I'm sympathetic to some of that. Myself personally, I'm quite inclined towards displays of, force against government agents. I've said this publicly. I think it would have been justified in the moment that the police officer was obviously kneeling on the neck of George Floyd and was obviously, evidently preventing him from breathing, and everyone could see that. It would have been justified for the civilians to pull out firearms and do whatever was necessary to prevent him from killing George Floyd. So I'm sympathetic to the use of violence in those cases. I'm a big believer in the Second Amendment. I'm a big believer in the right to own firearms, not specifically for self-defense, but also for defense against a tyrannical state. So I understand. I agree. And the famous picture now of protesters who burned down a police station and overturned cop cars and all the rest of it. I have sympathy with that. I understand, and I don't necessarily criticize them for that. However, there's the other side of it, and the people who are, whether they are protesters themselves or whether they're hijacking the protests for their own means, looting shops, beating up passers-by, assaulting white people for the sake of being white. And people say that, well, these are just criminals looking for an excuse. But we've all seen the footage of the protests. We've all seen them crowding around businesses. The windows are broken and coming out with TVs and all sorts. We've seen them throwing traffic cones into car windows and burning private property and all the rest of it. So I don't believe that it is just a small section of violent criminals. And then, of course, speaking about violent criminals, you have the police, who, as I said, are absolutely determined to prove everyone right, that they are the thugs that we all think they are, arresting journalists and shooting people on their own private property and spraying passers-by and tasing people in the cars who are just driving down the street. This is not a dignified response from the police. And all it goes to show is that a lot of the things that people say about them as a force, as a unit, not just individuals, is correct, that they are a law unto themselves. They have qualified immunity. They take advantage of that. And in America, at least, they're not legally obligated to provide protection from criminals. And very often it's from them that protection is required. So both sides are letting themselves down here quite badly.
Mm. You've touched briefly upon the divide between certain communities in America with reference to socioeconomics. What do you believe that divide is? What is it caused by? And do you think it's a valid excuse to go out and really just affirm a negative image of both sides?
Well, it depends what they're doing to some regards. I mean, if you're, looting a Target or burning down another black man's bar, that doesn't seem to me to be justified by whatever concerns you might have about the state that you live in. I think as regards to a community and the black community and the problems that they have, I think there are obviously economic concerns and there are cultural concerns. The biggest one, or a particularly prominent one, is obviously the absentee fathers, which is massively prevalent in the black community in America, single-parent households. Now, this isn't obviously to say that single parents are not good parents, just that the outcomes for children raised in single-parent households do lend themselves to more negative outcomes. And being so prevalent in the black community, that manifests itself in this way. There's also economic concerns. Even minority impoverished communities in America are by no means truly impoverished on an absolute scale. But we know that there are studies that show that really these kinds of fracturings in society are more related to relative poverty than to absolute poverty, and that the black community and individuals in the black community see a large relative racial divide in economic and financial share. And that can cause obviously these kinds of tensions and these kinds of feelings of, rightly or wrongly, feelings of injustice themselves. I think there are quite a lot of problems that aren't simply put down to unhappiness about this killing or unhappiness necessarily about extrajudicial killings by the police either. I think it runs a little bit deeper than that, and I think there are criticisms to be had of those communities, and that not everything that they're doing is justified by this one action or this sequence of actions by the police. I think it's much deeper than that.
Would you agree that the decision to label Antifa as a terrorist group is long overdue?
I personally wouldn't have done it, to be honest. You touched upon it earlier about how Antifa are an organised organisation that claim not to be. And I think what the reality of the situation is that you are Antifa if you say you are. If you turn up to a rally in a black mask, with a red and black flag or whatever else it might be, then you are Antifa, regardless of whether you have any actual official affiliation to more organised Antifa. We'll call them cells because they're a terrorist organization now, but And I think the problem with that is that if you can self-identify as Antifa, then it could well be the case that you will be identified as Antifa whether you are or not. So if you're a protester who comes in a mask, then you can be identified as a member of Antifa by the government. I think that's a danger in itself, much more so than a group of rebel rousers, essentially, who get up themselves. So it's a big risk, I think, doing things like this.
Do you see any real police reforms coming from the George Floyd situation, or is it just going to be covered over and forgotten about?
Well, what reforms are there to enact? I mean, strangle a black man to death isn't exactly in the police statutes, is it? And the method Chauvin used to kill George Floyd wasn't exactly, as far as I'm aware, in keeping with police restraint rules. So what exactly are they going to reform? I think possibly, as we mentioned before, the idea of qualified immunity, that may need to be looked at. I think there's an issue with police unions protecting bad police officers. That needs to be looked at. But in terms of, the practical day-to-day operational rule set by which the police operate on, I find it quite difficult to actually find where that ought to be changed. It's not as if there is codified institutional racism within these organisations, none that I can find at least. What exactly would you do at the individual police level with regards to day-to-day action to actually change things? I don't think you can. On a more broad scale, making police more accountable for their actions may go some way, but that has nothing to do with race, I don't think.
Right, just to move it on, the next topic is on controlling social media. And on Thursday, President Trump signed an executive order that calls for a re-examination of a law that currently protects social media companies from being held liable for the content of the posts users put on there. This comes after Twitter began fact-checking his own tweets. So I've got a quote from Forbes here. Trump signed an executive order targeting social media companies just days after Twitter tagged two of his tweets with fact-check warnings. The move could strip social media giants of their platforms rather than publisher privileges, and further opens the door for blockchain-based decentralized alternatives that are already beginning to threaten the dominance of Facebook and Twitter. Trump, who has regularly accused Facebook and Twitter of censoring conservative voices, claimed he wanted to defend free speech from one of the gravest dangers it has faced in American history. Now, there's already been talk of a legal challenge to the executive order, and some senior officials are saying that it simply won't work in practice. Should social media companies be held liable for the content posted by their users? Because it strikes me as a bit of a double-edged sword, not to mention that it would be incredibly difficult to administer.
Is that what the executive order is doing? Is it making them liable for the content, or is it forcing them to treat all content neutrally and to not ban certain content?
From what I gather, it's a re-examination of the law, and I think Trump has a preference towards making media companies liable in order to stop the monopolistic behaviour.
Okay, that does make sense, yeah. Well, there's, like you say, double-edged sword. There's kind of two sides to this. So the protections that are in place at the moment were basically created to stop, for example, phone companies being liable for the things that people say while using phones. These kind of protections were created before the internet, and therefore they're, in a sense, not fit for purpose. The tech companies themselves haven't really helped with this because they've basically appointed themselves as the arbiters of truth and propriety, the gatekeepers of what is right morally or, ethically, whether or not it's factually true. But at the same time are pretending that that's not what they're doing. They say things like, we're a company that believes in free speech, but free speech has limitations. Well, if free speech has limitations, it's no longer free. So I think they're being quite disingenuous about that. However, I think the executive order itself is wrong. I think that the protections that exist in law for certain companies are just favoritism, essentially, and that just repealing those protections selectively just creates another layer of laws which libertarians particularly should not be supportive of. I think it would be much better for libertarians and for people who are concerned, libertarians, conservatives who are usually the victims of these kinds of acts of censorship, which it de facto is, to ask for more clarification on the terms, more clear terms of use, and for then, whether it's government or anyone else, to enforce the contracts that each of us signed and the terms of use that each of us are forced to sign to use these platforms, to enforce them more effectively. No one's really sure on Facebook or Twitter or whatever else what exactly is allowed and isn't allowed. It seems to be made up on the spot. Likewise, the fact checks that go on can, in quite a few situations that I've seen, appear incredibly subjective. So I think these platforms ought to give us a more clear view of what exactly is allowed on. And then if they don't do that, because that's obviously a completely voluntary pursuit, then move to another platform. If President Trump doesn't like what Twitter are doing, move on to something else, move on to Gab. It's not like his followers wouldn't follow him there. There are other options out there which you can use, and we can decide. I don't like to say, the market will decide, but the market will decide which companies are trustworthy, which companies are honest with their consumers, and then ultimately they will win out.
If the executive order goes ahead, will it help to eliminate the leftist bias and censorship present in social media and, in the words of Trump, defend free speech, or will it simply fortify those on the left who already use it?
These things are governed mostly by algorithms in the first place. So I think there's already quite a lot of polarization within the kind of access, if you know what I mean. So as an example, my partner has a lot of left-wing friends, and herself is more inclined towards that kind of side of politics, not fully, but more inclined than I am, certainly. Has a lot more friends who are Labour voters. And as a result, the news that she gets compared to the news that I get about the exact same subject is radically different. And so there is already, I think, a large divide between the two sides that won't necessarily be impacted by Facebook and Twitter being forced to host it. Likewise, there are platforms like Gab, which tend to have far more people from, let's say, the right, and they just congregate there. And for example, places like Reddit tend to have people more from the left. So this is already a feature of the internet. It's already a feature of social media.
As much as the Democrats hate Donald Trump, we hate the lockdown. But fortunately, it is easing further now, and businesses are beginning to open up again. Most students are now back at school. It does certainly seem that there are those hysterical totalitarians who never want to see us coming out of lockdown, and an alarming number of them are so-called experts. But fortunately, the Foreign Secretary is not one of them. I've got a quote from the Financial Times here. Several scientists on the government's Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies have warned the latest move to ease lockdown restrictions may be premature and could jeopardise attempts to keep COVID-19 under control. During the hot weather over the weekend, there were pictures of crowded beaches and parks, suggesting some people were ignoring social distancing rules. Dominic Raab said the government had concluded its 5 tests for further easing of the lockdown, partly because new virus cases as well as deaths from COVID-19 were falling. Raab also noted the reproduction rate for the virus, the so-called R number, was below 1, meaning it should eventually peter out. If the death rates are declining and the daily number of new cases are falling, is it really premature to ease the lockdown restrictions?
Well, the lockdowns were ridiculous in the first place, so it's not premature. I think it's overdue by about 2 months. There is, as far as I've seen, no evidence that the lockdown has actually done anything other than destroy the economy. And it's my contention that actually the damage that it has done to the economy is far worse than even the worst case projections of the Imperial College, which in any case may have been wrong. I think we're going to be paying for this in a big way. You mentioned that there are a small coterie of hardcore authoritarians who want to see the lockdown continued. And certainly that's what the government says, because it can't admit that it's made a mistake. But the reality is that I think for quite a few weeks now, most people haven't taken the lockdown seriously, and we're starting to see that manifest itself in a big way. You have, for example, a few weeks ago, 20 or so protesters in the US protested for the end of the lockdown in Michigan, and the press labeled them as basically as domestic terrorists and treated them as if they were an existential threat to the human race. Likewise, you've got a small group of anti-lockdown protesters in London and a few other places like Manchester 2 weeks ago who were, swiftly arrested by the police and subjected to all kinds of, ridiculous insults from the public about selfishness and all the rest of it. And then we had the whole Dominic Cummings incident, which was an almost entirely private occurrence, by the way, in which no contact with anyone hardly occurred, which inspired outrage. And yet now, right at this moment, we have huge mass gatherings and riots in the US and in the UK, oddly enough, on a matter that has absolutely nothing to do with this country. And lo and behold, all of the public concerns in the media about viral transmission and the risk of COVID seem to have disappeared. Barely even mentioned in the reports. And, the hypocrisy is absolutely staggering. But it just demonstrates to me how few people believe in this lockdown, really. People want to go to the beach, they'll go to the beach, and the police, by and large, do nothing about it. People will say that the people going to the beach are, murderers who are killing grandma. and don't raise a word of concern about people gathering in their hundreds and in their thousands in the capital city and elsewhere. It's ridiculous, and it's a performative contradiction that exposes the fact that most people know that this lockdown is ridiculous. There's no other way to, I think, there's no other way to analyse it.
Do you think that the R rate is a reputable guide for changing policy?
No, I think at the moment, the reason to change policy now, aside from all the moral issues, is the economy. The economy is the biggest concern right now, and it's not talked about nearly enough. And the media are kind of drip feeding in suggestions that maybe it's going to be bad, but it's downplayed in a way that is going to prove quite shocking to a lot of people when it does come around. I think the government knows this, but as I said, it can't do a full 180 because then it would have to admit that it was wrong, and it cannot do that. But politicians cannot do that. Like, fundamentally, they're incapable of admitting that they were wrong. And so for me, the justification, it has nothing to do with the virus. There's no evidence that the virus is actually that dangerous, or economic collapse is dangerous.
Maybe their minds will change regarding Britain potentially bailing out the EU then, because with the Eurozone on the verge of collapse, there's talk of Britain contributing to the £670 billion EU recovery fund, and there's on the cards an extension to the transition talks. Now, we're already spending billions at home on various projects, such as the walking and cycling scheme. Should we also be helping to bail out the Eurozone as well?
Well, we're going to be incapable of doing so. So I think it's largely irrelevant. The EU has its own issues, and they're much more fractured in their relations now, especially over, as you say, that stimulus budget. But we're going to be in no situation whatsoever to be providing billions or tens of billions to any recovery outside of this country. We're going to be in a pretty severe downturn ourselves. And you know that the government are going to, for example, increase taxes, which is going to be completely counterproductive. And it's going to prolong the hardship that this country is going to be facing. And we are, for a very long time, not going to be as rich as we were. And we will never be as rich as we would have been had we not done this. And that is going to have a very real, tangible effect on the quality of life in this country. It's going to have a tangible effect on what the government can and cannot do with regards to spending. And I think what the government are probably going to do, because it might be quite difficult for them to engage in austerity, least of all because we've seen that the government will acquiesce to public opinion and it wants to retain that red wall that it's earned. So it's very likely that the government are going to eschew the idea of austerity and instead go for a more stealthy recompense of the spending that they've done through inflation. And they will allow the burden of all this furlough spending and of all this subsequent stimulus spending that will take place. They'll allow that burden to fall on savers and on pensions rather than the working people in their majority who vote for them. And we're going to be in no position to support or help the EU.
So, how did you come to be a libertarian?
Well, I was always on the more right side of things in terms of the way that I saw the world. I think my earliest political calling was David Cameron's idea of the big society, the idea that, you help communities voluntarily. There's no need for, massive amounts of government intervention. There's no need for massive amounts of government welfare spending. That by and large, if you take responsibility for yourself, you can then take responsibility for your community. And there's no real need for any official, busybodying. Then as it developed over the course of 5 or 6 years, moving to university and obviously getting involved with the Vote Leave campaign for Brexit, being exposed to people who were much more radical and I'd say much more educated than I was, became exposed to the ideas of libertarianism, classic liberalism, which more aligned with the values that I had, which around that time I began to realise were not represented by the Conservative Party, and that the idea of the big society was something that the Conservative Party itself didn't believe in. And so it was a push over the edge, if you will, down the rabbit hole to realisation of what I believed and of what political persuasion I had and where that was best met.
And could you recommend any libertarian texts, or do you have any favourite libertarian thinkers?
Well, I myself cringe a lot. I'm an objectivist, so I will probably always recommend Ayn Rand's work. But personally, I come at libertarianism from a more bland, boring economic perspective, and so for me, reading key libertarian economic texts is the most interesting thing for me, and the most necessary thing, I think, for a lot of people to be aware of those arguments. So obviously, the simple writers like Henry Hazlitt, for example, and Thomas Sowell, Robert Murphy, these are key texts that everyone has to read.
So they might teach you about mathematics in school, but they certainly don't teach you about money.
Well, exactly. Or economic theory in general. I mean, economic theory, especially from a more Austrian perspective, as the one I take, is not really a mathematical pursuit. It's the study of consequences. It's the study of essentially of logic, of behavioral logic. And it's amazing to me how few people actually understand how that works and actually understand that just because, for example, a politician has an intent to do something doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the only effect of that something, or indeed that is going to be the effect of that something. And far too few people are even basically conversant with principles of economics. And if anyone should be, then it should be libertarians. So engaging with those texts and engaging with articles on economics on a daily or weekly basis is absolutely critical, I think.
Absolutely. What makes the UK Liberty Party unique? Because there's a lot of libertarian parties out there, classical liberal parties. What makes the UK Liberty Party stand apart from the rest of them?
I think there's two main differences. The first thing is the focus on philosophy rather than politics specifically. I think a lot of the parties, be it the Libertarian Party in America or even the Libertarian Party in the UK, do tend to have a politics first focus. The idea that libertarianism or libertarian ideas in government are pragmatically the best thing for the country. And that's something I certainly agree with. However, we take a much more philosophy and moral basis for our claims. And so a lot of what we put out on social media, a lot of the angling of our constitution and of our policy aims on the website is geared towards the idea that these are moral ideas as well as pragmatic ideas. And so we focus on educating people not just on, the political situation, the detriments and the benefits of our ideas, but also on, engaging people with a new philosophy, a philosophy for their lives, which can then be applied in the political realm. So that's one aspect of our uniqueness. But I think our best unique selling point really is our focus on technology. So we have a website and a system which is actually really quite innovative in politics in general, not just in the liberty movement. So we have basically an online system, which is basically an incentive system that works on the idea of producing and paying credits and actual money to people for doing things for the party. So this originally started out as just a points-based system. And if you engage in activity on the website, whether that's contributing articles or sharing the page or inviting new members and other such stuff like that, then you would get points, and those points would be redeemable for things in the store. At the moment, that's a very small amount of things. That could be like a mug or a hoodie. Maybe it will develop into pins and pens and that sort of thing. And then down the line, as we become more able to challenge for parliamentary seats, that would be support from the party, for example, with things like deposit fees and that sort of thing. So it's our way of encouraging people to do things in the party and to be rewarded for doing things in a way that's not necessarily tangible in the more traditional party model. And then recently we added another element, which is that if people take up official positions in the party as area managers or regional managers or local group leaders or whatever else it might be, then they will also get discounts on their membership fees. So if you are incredibly effective in inviting members and retaining support for the party, then you will get increasing increments of deductions to the fees that you pay as a way of kind of recompensing you financially for your work. That's something that not many other parties or any other parties that I know of are doing. And it's certainly something I think, as a libertarian interested in economics and the idea of incentives and all that sort of thing, that it's something that can be and will be quite successful.
It sounds like a great way to boost engagement. You obviously mentioned there the greater use of technology being used. Do you see that party engagement more widely will move forward with a greater use of technology, not just in libertarian parties, but also parties of all political colours?
Well, I suspect it must do. I mean, obviously, technology plays a great part in every party's kind of framework with regards to stuff like databases and membership databases and CRM data and all that sort of thing. But as far as I can see, there's very few practical applications for that in regards to activism. So you have, in most cases, a local branch, and that local branch does its own thing essentially, and then there's a more national strategy that comes in around election times and obviously with the general media cycle. But very few people actually using technology as a way to incentivize more round the clock work. You know, we tend to have this very cyclically where Labour activists will suddenly surge in popularity around election time and then disappear into the ether, you know, for the next 5 years, and the same with Conservatives and Lib Dems. So as a way to maintain more regular activism, I certainly think this is a really, you know, intuitive and interesting and innovative way to do that. And I think we're one of the first people to do that. And I'm surprised that more haven't already done it, considering the technology is available.
What kind of activities will the UK Liberty Party be undertaking in the future?
Well, our focus at the moment is purely on growing the membership and convincing libertarians, anarchists, and everyone of that kind of persuasion to join our party and to help out. We get asked the question a lot, you know, there's already a libertarian party in the UK. So if you are libertarians or if you are the liberty movement, then why not just join them? But of course, the liberty movement in the UK is tiny and in a way insignificant. We're not part of the national debate. We have a few think tanks like the Taxpayers Alliance or the IEA who are more or less on our side, but it's not a cohesive movement. And so our aim for the next few years is to basically, if we can, eclipse the other parties in this area by providing a genuine, engaging platform for activism, for support, to really build up a solid base that isn't just a disparate handful of people who just provide money and maybe turn up to the conference every couple of years.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Libertarian Listener. It's been a joy. Thanks for joining me.
No problem. Thanks for the invitation.
And I'll be seeing you for the next edition of the Libertarian Listener very soon. Thanks for listening.